All right, good afternoon. It looks like we have a few people joining us this afternoon. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us today for our second installment of the Adventures in Field Research seminar series. We're put together and hosted by Lincoln Memorial University's School of Mathematics and Sciences. This is a wonderful opportunity, I think, for folks that are interested in field research to get together and share some stories and adventures and a little bit of science along the way. While you have been admitted to this session, your mics will be muted. And during the end, there'll be a question answer period where you'll be able to unmute your mic and ask questions. If for some chance you think that you might forget your question, feel free to use the chat box to enter that question, and near the end of the session we'll make sure that we get your question asked. So thank you all once again for joining us. I'm very pleased to present Dr. Amy Boyd from Warren Wilson College, and she's going to deliver a talk today titled Death Watch in the Desert and Other Adventures. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Boyd.
All right, thank you, Dr. Rollins. I'm going to share my screen if I can. Let me see if I can get that going. All right, can everybody see that okay? Good. All right, thank you for having me. I love the idea of this seminar series, and I hope I'll be able to attend some more of them, but I'm really pleased to be here today. I teach at Warren Wilson College, which is a tiny little college in the mountains of North Carolina, and I'm an ecologist, a plant ecologist. I study pollination biology and plant evolution and a whole bunch of different things. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that today. I've been really fortunate in my mind to do field work in a bunch of different places in North and Central America. So I've pointed out some of those here. I haven't wandered all over the world, but to me, this is a big deal because I grew up in a household that really struggled to make ends meet. And though I dreamed of travel, I didn't get to do it when I was a kid. And it's really been as a biologist that I've been able to get out and see some of the places that I would watch on PBS and read about, such as the tropics and the desert. So I feel very fortunate that that's my work, that I get out and explore amazing places. So as I was preparing for today's talk, I found myself creating a list of lessons that I've learned as a field biologist. And it turned into a really long list. And I'm not going to share all of that with you today. I've just picked out a few to share with you to start us off today. And then I'm going to focus on one particular project. So 5 of the lessons out of the many lessons that I've learned in my field studies as a biologist. First of all, if there are bears hanging out in your study plots, your work will just have to wait a little while. This happened to me once when I was studying pollination in the mountains outside of Tucson. I camped out and was there at my study plots at dawn, but so were the bears right in the middle of my study plots. And so I just took a little break and didn't quite get started as early as I wanted to that morning. Secondly, when you're doing field work, it's a really good idea to have a supply of duct tape wrapped around your water bottle. I learned this tip from a good friend of mine who was a graduate student with me, and I met with her one day over lunch right before I went to Costa Rica as a graduate student, and I was sort of picking her brain about what I needed to know, what I needed to take with me, and one of the things she said was, make sure that you wrap duct tape around your water bottle. I thought, well, that's it. That sounds smart. Duct tape's good for all sorts of things. And I have used it for all sorts of things. It's really good for pulling tiny spines out of your fingers from the cactus that you're working with. It's good to repair your boots when you're out in the field, when they fall apart. It's good for all kinds of things. But what I didn't know was that her advice was very specific, because duct tape is really good for getting ticks off of your clothing. When you're working in the tropics, you can end up with hundreds of tiny ticks crawling all over your clothes, and the easiest way to get rid of them is by using duct tape. So there's a little tip for you. Third, if you teach a field course for American teenagers in the tropics, you need to worry about a lot of things. You need to worry about whether they'll get bitten by a really poisonous snake. You'll have to worry about whether they get each other pregnant along the way. But you also, it turns out, have to worry about whether they'll get leeches up their noses. I didn't think about that. When I took this group of high school students to Costa Rica for 3 weeks, I worried the whole time about the poisonous snakes and the potential pregnancies. And neither of those things happened. But when I got back about a week later, one of the parents called me up and he said, so I'm just wondering whether my son Becker, who is pictured in this picture with a coconut, whether he was in the water while you were in Costa Rica. And I said, well, yeah, Becker's the one who was always in the water. Anytime there was water, Becker was in it. You can see him in this waterfall here. He was always in the water. Well, it turned out Becker got a leech up his nose that started out really small, but a couple weeks later, it was big, and that's when they found it. So things you have to worry about. Fourth, when you're doing field work in Mexico and you get stopped at military checkpoints, it's a good idea to be really friendly and to give the soldiers cookies. Many of the Mexican soldiers at these checkpoints are really young and they're missing their families, and it makes them really happy to have cookies. So take cookies along with you. And fifth, and this is a really big one for me, I learned that I personally really don't like doing field work alone. For a little while, it's okay, but it's not my cup of tea, which really came as a surprise to me. I love being alone. I spend tons of time being alone. I grew up with a big room all myself, and I was always in it, just doing stuff by myself. And I knew I loved being out in the woods and out in the field, out in wild places. So I figured it'd be great to be out in the woods by myself doing field work. I hated it as a graduate student. It really bummed me out. I found myself out there doing my field work thinking, why am I here? What is this about? I don't know why I'm doing this. And it didn't work for me. So I learned pretty quickly that I need to have other people with me, that it needs to be a social activity. And especially, I do a lot of my fieldwork now with students. So these are pictures of some of the groups of students I've worked with over the years. For me, fieldwork is more, and science in general is more meaningful when I do it with others. So one of those collaborative projects that I've been working on for the last 25 years started when I was starting my PhD work at the University of Arizona. My graduate advisor, Lucinda McDade, came to me and to another graduate student at the very beginning of my graduate program, and she said, you know, we need to start a long-term ecological study. And I thought, sure, I'll do whatever, but I didn't really understand what I was getting myself into. I knew that there was a real value to long-term ecological studies. I had worked at a long-term ecological research station before. We tend in the sciences to focus on short-term gains a lot of the time. But when you study something for a really long period of time, you learn things, you elucidate questions that you can't do in the short term. So there's a real value to that. So Lucinda said, let's pick something. Let's just pick a plant and we're going to study it just for one day a year, and we'll just keep going, and eventually it'll be really cool. And I thought, sure, why not? So we talked about it, we threw around a bunch of different options, and we ended up centering on this cactus, the Nichols Turk's head cactus, which is a variety of a species of cylindrical cactus. It's really lovely. It has sort of bluish green flesh and pinkish spines. It's really quite lovely. It's amazingly cryptic, though. It looks really obvious in this picture, but it hides in the desert surprisingly well. It's really hard to find. This cactus, there's two varieties of the species. The variety Horizontaloneus is found in Texas and New Mexico and Mexico, and you can see those populations indicated here, and it's doing just fine. The variety Horizontaloneus is flourishing as far as we know. But the variety I work on, variety Nicholii, is only found in a few very small populations that we know of. One down here in Sonora in the Sierra El Viejo, and then 3 in Arizona, 2 of which are on the Tohono O'odham Reservation, and 1 is on public land, and that's where we work. We're actually not even sure the population in Sonora is even still there. So this species is of real concern. It's been endangered, listed as endangered for quite a while. So just a little timeline. In 1979, the cactus that I study was federally listed as endangered. In 1988, the mountains where we do our work, the Watermen Mountains, was designated as an area of critical environmental concern by the Bureau of Land Management, specifically, well, in part at least, to protect the cactus. There were some other objectives there, but that was one of the reasons that they designated that area as an area of environmental concern. We started our work in 1995. In 2000, this particular part of the mountains was designated as part of the Ironwood Forest National Monument by President Clinton. And that was a big deal. We were pretty excited about that, to have our plots moved from more general BLM land into a more protected status. But that turned out to be more complex than it appeared to be. So we'll tell you more about that story as we go along. This is a map of the Ironwood Forest National Monument, designated in blue here. It encompasses state trust land as well as BLM land. And if we zoom in, this is the Watermen Mountains. It's a tiny little mountain range west of Tucson that not very many people have ever heard of. Even people who live in Tucson and love to hike and get out in wild places, most of them have never heard of the Watermen Mountains. So it's not a place where people go very often, but it's beautiful. The Ironwood National Forest is named after this tree that has lovely lavender flowers. When it flowers in the springtime, it's called the Ironwood tree. It's really quite beautiful. But the area is also known for a lot of its wildlife. This is an elf owl that lives in the saguaro cactus, nests in saguaro cactus in the monument. And there's also some interesting archaeological sites, such as these petroglyphs that are found as well there. So a lot of really interesting things going on this particular piece of land. Here's a view from our study plots. We're not that far out of Tucson. It takes about an hour to get there from Tucson. But once you're there and up in the mountains, you can look out for miles and miles and see nothing in terms of houses or roads. It's really just an amazingly wild place, so very close to that urban area. So we love it. It's really, really fun to get up there. The last piece of the timeline that I'll share with you is in 2009, there was another review of the endangered status of the cactus, and it was recommended at that point that the plant should remain classified as endangered. And in part, that was coming out of the work that we've done. But I'll give you another update farther in. So this is my working group. Like I said, I really like working with other people. Collaborative work is something that enriches my scientific work a lot. It's also really problematic. I've had some collaborations that have been huge headaches, but this is not one of them. This team of women is so much fun to work with. The woman in the red shirt is Lucinda McDade, who started us on the project. She was my graduate advisor. And then Betsy Arnold on the left and Margaret McIntosh next to her are the other 2 collaborators that work with us. And you can also see in this picture what we have designated as our big ass calipers, the largest calipers I've ever seen, which are great tools for measuring the width of a cactus without getting your fingers impaled. So what have we done? Basically, we just went out in 1995 to the Watermen Mountains, and we established 4 study plots that had our cactus in it. We chose 3 different plots with different aspects of slope, and then 1 on fairly level terrain up in the mountains. And then we found every cactus in those plots, and we marked them with numbered metal tags, and we mapped and noted the location of each one of them. And ever since then, we've gone back every year and found those plots and found the cactus. So this is a picture looking at one of those flatter plots where we've stuck flags in the ground next to all the cactus, and then we go back and we collect data on them. Now this picture is a little bittersweet for me because this plot You can see a whole bunch of flags there indicating different cacti. Today, there's only 7 in this plot. So it's really, really kind of sad to see this picture. This is an old photograph. Every year we go back, we measure height, width, we check whether they flowered. Luckily, this plant holds on to its fruits for over a year after it flowers. And that makes us really, really happy because they flower in the middle of the summer, in the middle of the desert, in the middle of the day. We did watch them bloom one time. We went up one summer early on in the project. We said, we need to see these plants flower. So we had been sort of watching the population a little bit, and Margaret said, I think it's going to flower today or tomorrow. So we need to go out tomorrow and see them flower. And the plan was, we thought that they would flower early in the morning, that they would open, the flowers would open early in the morning. So we would just go out when it was still dark, and we'd take lots of water, and we'd hike up to the mountains when it was still dark and so not very hot. And then we'd see them flower, and it would be great. And we did that. And we got up there, and the buds were fat and ready, and nothing happened. And we waited, and we waited, and we kept looking at them saying, they're gonna open. They're gonna open, I know it's gonna happen. But it was getting hotter and hotter. We dodged into little patches of shade under the almost non-existent vegetation that's there. And eventually we just gave up and just sat in the sun next to the cactus, watching the buds, waiting. It's the only time I've ever sit next to a plant and waited for it to open its flowers and watched it happen. And I'm so glad we did. It was brutal. I've never been so dehydrated in my life, but we got to see them open and flower, and they were lovely. So anyway, bottom line is, we've never gone back to see them flower in the summer. It was horrible, but we can go back in February and know if they flowered because their fruits are still on the plants. We also know what kind of condition they're in, and I'll show you some of that in a minute. And since 2006, we have photographed every plant every year. So we have a photographic record of them as well. This is the flowers. This was actually that day when we sat and watched them flower. This is a cactus that opened its flowers that day. They all open on the same day, and they only flower one day a year. So we got really lucky that day. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a plant with a fruit on it. It doesn't look like much, but this little nugget of white in the center of that plant is the fruit. They actually make fuzzy, dry fruits that get caught in those spine clusters and don't actually get released until a couple of years later, when the growth of the plant has expanded those spines and released those fruits. So that's just a useful little tidbit for us. We look for babies every year. We look for new recruits into the population. So this is a photograph of 2 adults, one on the left and one on the right, and then 5 babies, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, tucked at the bottom next to those adults, with a little measuring tape for scale. Sometimes we find individual young cactus just out by themselves, but almost always we find them at the base of the adult cactus. They seem to do better when they're protected by the adults for at least a period of time. This is just showing some pictures of those cactus at different stages of their development as they go along. And like I said, we keep track of their condition. So have they been chewed on by some kinds of animals like this one has? Do they look sunburnt or necrotic in some way? Sometimes the whole top of the cactus gets scraped off and eaten, and what's left behind is just the dry, desiccated base. Sometimes the inside gets scooped out by an animal. And we even have, early on in our study, we often came back and we would find all of the spines from the cactus still intact in the form of the cactus, and all of the flesh gone, because rodents would come up from underneath and just eat all the good stuff out and leave the spine clusters behind. So we take these pictures and we investigate the remains to try to figure out what's killing them. We really want to know, why is this cactus struggling to survive? What's threatening it? And hopefully what we can do to stop or slow that progress. These photographs show the same cactus in 1 year on the top, looking very healthy and happy. And then where it used to be on the bottom picture. The tag was still there, but the cactus is gone. So basically our story of this cactus is not a happy one. That's what I mean by death watch in the desert. We go back every year and we have watched this cactus population over year after year just decline. It's pretty depressing. I'm hoping that maybe eventually our science will lead to something that can help them. But we started out in 1995 at the beginning of the study with 124 plants in those initial plots. In the years between 1995 and 2018, 111 new plants emerged and 204 died. So you can see that they are recruiting some new plants into the population, but there's a lot more death than recruitment. And so in 2018, there were only 31 living plants. In 2020, last February, there were only 27 left in the plots. So it's not a happy story. So what's going on? Well, first of all, here's some of the data. So you can see very clearly, you don't even need statistics on this one. The number of living plants has decreased over time. As we've gone back year after year, we've seen that very steep decline. We also know that mortality has increased significantly over the study period. Those two things go together, obviously. Over time, the amount of cactus that die each year go up. Recruitment has been pretty good. It's been pretty steady, but not fairly low and definitely insufficient to offset the deaths that we're seeing. So what are the threats? There's a bunch. US Fish and Wildlife Service, in their reports on this particular cactus, identify a bunch of threats. One is mining. These mountains are rich in a lot of minerals that are in high demand. The cactus that we study is only found on limestone, and limestone tends to be associated with minerals that are desirable. And so this area has a long history of mining. There's actually a small mine right next to some of our study plots that's been abandoned for a long time. But the mining interest is still out there. There are mining corporations that are still trying to get access and trying to eliminate the Ironwood Forest National Monument so they can get in there and extract those mineral resources. So that's a concern, an ongoing concern. And congressmen in Arizona have supported those mining efforts in trying to overturn the designation of this national monument. Luckily, they have not been yet successful. So we're keeping our fingers crossed on that one. Another thing that happens in this area is that it's pretty close to the border. So we get a lot of smuggling in through that area, both drug smuggling and people smuggling, illegal immigration. We see evidence of this in our study plots all the time. We often find debris left behind by people who are moving through the area. And we get buzzed by Border Patrol helicopters every time we're out there. So we'll be out there doing our little cactus work, measuring our cactus, and then they'll just come swooping down over our heads and hover and make lots of noise and be really irritating. And I have not many times held up my clipboard to the helicopter and said, look, science, leave us alone. But they keep going it. Third is allele collecting. Cactus are like orchids, this a kind of plant that is susceptible to poaching. They are desirable for people's houseplants and garden plants. This particular article that's shown here is actually about saguaro cactus. One of the things that national park officials have done to try to crack down on illegal saguaro cactus sales and collecting is to insert microchips into the cactus in the national park. so that when they go to nurseries, they can scan the cactus and see if there are any microchips in there to see if they've been illegally collected. Luckily, our cactus, as all the years we've been out there, we have seen no evidence of illegal collecting, but we were worried about that at the beginning, and it's certainly something we have to keep an eye out for. Off-road vehicles are a big problem. They especially were a big problem before it became a national monument. They were all over the place. Now that it's national monument, they're not supposed to be out there, but we still see evidence of them. They can crush the cactus, they can kick them up and uproot them. So that's a real threat. Buffalo grass, another invasive plants, but especially buffalo grass is an invasive that's coming into this area. It can grow in thick layers across the desert, like you see at the base of this photograph. It grows very quickly when there's rain, and then when the climate or when the weather dries out, now you have this thick layer of very flammable material that will burn hot and fast. And that's not the kind, these habitats are not fire adapted at all. And they're certainly not adapted to a hot, quick fire. And that kind of fire that can get started in old, dry buffalo grass and rip through these areas will kill pretty much all of the plants that are there. So there are volunteers out there trying to collect. This area in this particular photograph has actually been cleared of buffalo grass, believe it or not, by a bunch of volunteers, but it's a constant effort. Another threat is drought, and this is one that we've done a lot of work on. This area has been, I mean, first of all, if you're not used to studying in the desert, you might think it's a desert. Why do we need to worry about drought? But this is a desert that depends on regular rainfall. Not a lot of rainfall, not like I see in North Carolina, but the rainfall that it gets is something that those plants and animals depend on. So when there's drought conditions compared to what is normal in this desert, it can be a problem. And what we've seen over time is that drought conditions have become more severe over time. So between 2000 and 2004, there was about 38% of the time, this area was in moderate to extreme drought. Between 2010 and 2014, it was 83% of the time that it was in moderate to extreme drought. So that's a concern. It's really increasing with what we see happening in climate change. And we wondered if that might have to do with what's going on with our cactus. So if we look at this plot again of the number of living plants over time, we see that declining. I've marked here with this orange bar when we see abnormal drought conditions happening. So maybe that's part of the story. We wanted to know whether that's part of what's going on. So we've been studying that. Do these patterns that we're seeing in mortality reflect drought conditions? Well, it's not so clear, actually. When we plot annual precipitation over time, we actually see that total precipitation actually may be declining a little bit, but it's not statistically significant. And if we try to relate different characteristics of the plant to precipitation, we do see that they are less likely to flower if it's dry, and therefore less likely to reproduce. So that could be a problem for recruitment. But if we track mortality and recruitment directly to precipitation, we see no relationship directly. So we can't really blame it on precipitation per se. So we've been looking at some other questions. There's got to be something else that's causing these plants to die. One of the other things that's changed over this period of time is the way that wildlife has been treated in this area. So when, remember that the area that we're studying in became a national monument in the year 2000, which is right here. And in about the year 2006, a wildlife guzzler, which is basically just a water tank, was placed in the area right next to our study plots. And what we've seen ever since then is a much steeper decline in our plants and evidence of this lovely animal pictured here, the bighorn sheep. Now, bighorn sheep are native to this area. They could have been around earlier, but we never saw any evidence of them before. We never saw their scat. We certainly never saw the animals. Since that wildlife guzzler has been placed in there, we see their scat all the time. We see the animals in our plots regularly, and we see evidence of them actually messing with the plants themselves. So we're a little concerned about that. One of the things that we've seen is we've tracked the kinds of remains that are left behind by the plants when they are dead or when they're gone, when we come back and suddenly there's no cactus there, is that the kind of remains has changed over time. So early on in the study, we almost never came back to find nothing where a cactus used to be. So that's what these 0 dots are. No missing cactus with nothing left behind. We always had some evidence of, a piece of the cactus left, some bite marks, some evidence of them. Today, though, we find a lot of cactus with no remains at all. The ground's just been scraped completely clean and everything is gone. And that, we believe, is consistent with what the bighorn sheep do. They tend to come in, scrape the cactus completely off the ground, maybe eat it, maybe toss it to the side, but they're gone. So mammal predation, we think, is a real threat. Not just the bighorn sheep, although we think that that's probably one of the biggest threats, but javelina, which is in the top picture here, rodents as well, a number of other mammals that are in the area. But we really believe from our evidence that the bighorn sheep are the biggest one. And we're getting ready to do some genetic tests to try to test that out. We're going to collect their scat and see if we can find the DNA of our cactus in it as our smoking gun. So again, here's her picture. No deaths with no remains early in the study. Now, today, 100% of the time when we go back and we have a cactus that's gone that was there the year before, there is nothing left. We have no evidence of rodent activity or whatever might be going on there. So it's consistent with this sheep pawing that we're seeing. So what we think is going on is that mammal predation is probably the most likely proximate cause of the death of these mature cactus. And that drought, instead of being a direct proximate cause, is more like the ultimate cause, that as we get more drought, the animals are more likely to go after the cactus. When they're not drought stressed, they have other things they can feed on. But in the years when they're really drought stressed, they're more likely to go after this really heavily armored cactus. In this graph, I'm just showing where the most recent US Fish and Wildlife report happened. So we've seen a lot of decline ever since then. This year, the US Fish and Wildlife Service biologist who's in charge of this plant was charged with writing a report that would lead to delisting this species. And I'm not saying whether it should or not. It was a very direct request from the administration. Please write a report that will help us delist this species. Fortunately, this biologist was pretty good, and she worked with us to try to figure out how she could include enough evidence that might block that particular action. Because as you can see, they're still threatened. They're more in bad shape now than they were the last time the reports were written. So what's going on right now with this cactus? We're still out there. We're still waving to the Border Patrol helicopters. We're still studying the old plots with their 27 cactus left behind. One of the plots only has 2, I think. But we've also started a new study. So we've found populations in the Watermen Mountains, not far from our original populations, which were up on the mountains themselves. We've found populations in the Bajadas, down on the flat areas, that seem much healthier. We didn't know those existed when we started the initial study, but they're there. And we thought, let's expand. Let's see what's going on down on the Bajadas and see if it's a different story than what we're seeing up on the mountains. So about 3 years ago, we started 2 new plots with a little over 100 new plants, and we're tracking them in the same way every year. So far, the story looks really different, thankfully. They seem to be doing better, and we don't see any evidence of bighorn sheep down there. Coincidental, maybe, but I think it's probably more than that. So we're digging in a little bit deeper. We got a new grant recently to study soil type and soil crusts, the microbiotic soil crusts that are around these cactus, to see if that makes a difference in terms of where they are and how they're doing. We're going to do some DNA testing of the scat, like I said, to try to see if the sheep are directly related to what's going on. We're going to dig more deeply into weather conditions in microhabitats. So we're going to put out some eye buttons in these plots where our cactus are, and then in areas close by where it's a little different, and see if we can track some of the details of climate that might be having an impact here. So that's where we're going. We're still going. It's not the happiest study in the world, but it's a happy place. It's a really, really beautiful environment. And it gets me out there in this amazing desert at least once a year. And I'm grateful for that. So with that, I'll thank my colleagues, Lucinda, Margaret, and Betsy, and many, many diverse field assistants over the years, and some grant funding from the University of Arizona Herbarium, my college's faculty development funds, and a grant from the Arizona Department of Agriculture and the USDA. So with that, anybody have any questions?
Amy, I don't want to dominate the questions, but I put several in the chat. If you want to.
Okay, let me see if I can see those. Hold on.
We'll start with those, and then people can.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Did I capture any data on what might pollinate the cactus flowers? We have not done that. Well, actually, I should back up for a second. I have not done that, but Margaret McIntosh, who is one of the 4 women on the project, she is actually an expert on cactus bees. So I know she has collected some cactus bees in the flowers and has done a little bit of work with that. So we think it's mostly bees.
Yeah, okay.
Let's see, are folks poaching some of the cactus? Not that we can tell from our species. We really were very worried about that from the beginning. And we were very careful. We always are very careful about not leaving any sign of our plots because we don't want to attract attention. But fortunately, we've never seen any evidence of poaching. It's pretty clear that that's not going on, at least in the study plots we're working with. So I'm grateful for that. Let's see, are there efforts to propagate the cactus and attempt to reintroduce? That's something I would like to work on in the future. I haven't yet, but that's something I'm looking at for the future. So I have a sabbatical next year, and I'm hoping to do at least some groundwork for that, because I think that could be interesting. Have we looked towards using grazing exclusion fencing to protect the cactus from mammals? This is an interesting question because it actually raises a bit of a dilemma for us, because when you're dealing with a plant that is managed by people who are interested in wildlife, you get some interesting conflicts. They really want to help us with the cactus. They want to know our data. They want to hear about it. They want to go out in the field with us. It's all great until we say, we think it's the bighorn sheep. And then they say, la, 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 la. They don't want to know about that because they like their bighorn sheep. They're big cuddly mammals, right? People like bighorn sheep. They want to see them. They want to encourage them. So we've talked about it. I think that's what they need to do. But we haven't got much cooperation from the land managers at this point. Hopefully at some point we might be able to leverage that, but we'll see. Joe De Silva says, I guess there's a combination of more than one factor. Yeah, I mean, obviously that's the deal. With any endangered species, you're usually going to see more than one factor. So we think it's climate, we think it's mammal predation. There may be other factors that we're trying to elucidate now to sort of really tease out what's going on. But it's, yeah, multiple factors. What's been the greatest obstacle? That's a good question. I don't know that we've had a lot of obstacles per se, and that's kind of nice. Our research is low budget. We don't really need much money. This grant that we just got is the first funding we've had in 25 years. Not because we couldn't get any, but because we've never needed it, right? So we've never gone after it. The new aspects of our study will take some funding, so we're glad to have that grant. But that's the thing about field ecology. You know, you go out with a ruler and you can learn a lot of things. You don't need a lot of stuff. I guess for me, living in North Carolina, the biggest obstacle is just getting there once a year and carving out the time for that. But that's become such a great part of my scientific work that I love it, and I make it work. I guess really the biggest obstacle is just figuring out how to answer questions that are not easy to get at. You know, we've talked about maybe putting out wildlife cameras to see if we can actually catch animals in the act of destroying our cactus. But then you run into questions of, okay, where exactly do you put them? And is that going to attract attention to our plots that we don't want? Are the cameras going to get stolen? You know, there's all those kinds of questions. So it's really that sort of logistical challenge of figuring out just how to get the right information to prove what we think is going on. You know, as good biologists, we feel like we know the story now, kinda, but showing proof is harder. Okay, let's see what else. Have we done any work with meteorologists? Indirectly, they've certainly provided us with data, and we've been working with a wildlife biologist who is a statistician and has done a lot of work with meteorology, and so he's really helped us try to dig into that work. I didn't show it today, but a lot of our most recent statistics has been looking at Drought Index, which is different from total precipitation and may give us better evidence of what's really how the climate and the weather is impacting the plants. But even then, the data is really complex, and it's hard to show that direct relationship. And in fact, here's an interesting thing. When we wrote our the paper that was just published last year, we actually had to fight with the reviewers a lot, because we had reviewers who read the paper which said, hey, we've done all of this research and all of the statistics, and there is no relationship between drought and the mortality of our cactus. And we proved it. We showed it. It was obvious. And the reviewers would come back and say, no, it's drought. You have to change your conclusions. They didn't say analyze it this way because you analyzed it wrong. They didn't say anything about the analysis. They just said your conclusion is wrong. And we had to really wrestle with people who wanted us to come up with the conclusion they thought we should have, and we thought we were going to have, but that's not what the data showed us. So that's been interesting. Let's see. Buffalo grass, you know, I don't know what kind of grass it is. I can't remember. I used to know. It's from Africa, I believe, but I could be wrong about that. But I don't remember. I don't remember what kind of grass it is. Let's see. What has been the greatest achievement in the research? I think it's simply it really comes down to being there every year and watching and carefully tracking what's going on with this population that nobody had really paid attention to before. And so I think that's where the achievement lies. And I really think, I hope that the real achievement is still in the future, that we'll eventually be able to use that to leverage real help for this species. We haven't gotten there yet. But I'm hoping that maybe with a new administration, we can get some backing. So let's see. Do I seem to be an extrovert? That's really interesting. I'm actually not. I'm so not an extrovert. I really, really am an introvert. I sort of channel my inner extrovert when I'm teaching. Since that's what I do for my living, I can do it in settings like this, but I really, by nature, am an introvert, which is why finding out that I didn't like doing research by myself, that was a real surprise to me. How do I think this plays a role in my interest in leading classes abroad and collaborating with colleagues? Again, it came as a surprise. I still am happiest when I'm alone in my house reading, right? I get fed by that time regenerating alone, but I guess a lot of it has to do with the fact that research for its own sake isn't rich enough for me.
So Amy, let me add to that. So I'm an extrovert, and you know, I guess I made an assumption there. And I see that, you know, Mary Ellis also said, I'm an introvert too. So I have a lot of introverts I work with. I think it's pretty common in sciences.
Sure.
And only last year did someone give me a good definition of what that means. And really, it's that you gain energy from being around with others.
Yes.
Or it draws the energy out of you and you need the weekend to recover from teaching. And that's where I realized, you know, my best friends in the department, I'll call them up on Saturday, hey, let's go get a beer. Oh no. I had a tough week. And I'm like, what do you mean? It's like, I did a guest lecture. So I had one extra lecture this week and it's exhausted me. And I'm like, wow, that's all it took, huh?
Yeah.
So, so I've only learned that in the last year. I'm 54, but I do know that I love being around other people. And it's, and I wanted to propose an idea maybe that answers your question, which is maybe it's the opportunity to bounce ideas off one another that we really love as scientists. And then having someone else there to confirm or refute some of your hypotheses is a big part of what we learn to be as scientists. So
I think that's absolutely true for me. And I do go by that definition of what an introvert is. I get recharged by being alone. I love being with others and I love teaching, but it draws energy out of me. It drains me. I need that time alone. But having said that, I don't know that I would be here today if research was my focus. It's really the teaching that feeds me in my work. And so keeping going as a research biologist has worked for me primarily because I've engaged students in learning through that. Okay, Rachel has a question, looks like.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to kind of add on to what you're talking about, working with other people as a scientist, you know, we need that critical feedback that we get from reviewers and from colleagues. But one of the great things about working with students is they're always asking questions, and a lot of it is stuff we know, but we also get so used to being in our systems and focusing on the specific questions we're focusing on. And then you have a student ask something and you realize, I've never thought to question that. And so a lot of times, you know, reviewers have a different level of things they bring to your work, but having a completely naive audience can bring really tremendous insight that people who don't work with undergraduates, I think, take for granted.
Yes.
But I was going to ask specifically about, so I've had a mix of working away from my college and at my college. And so I wonder, you know, you're clearly in love with the study system, and it's not, you know, where you work most of the year. So I wonder then, you know, obviously you can only take students out there so much, I imagine, you know, because of funding limits. This is something I come up against. And so do you have sort of another sort of equally important study system in Asheville or surrounding area? Or do you kind of have more student-directed research projects that may or may not be let's say, published on the same level. So I sort of struggle with like, you know, being grounded in Virginia and then also wanting to go work in exotic places.
Yeah, I do all of the above. So first of all, I've never taken students out to Arizona with me. I did have one student who graduated in December last year and then happened to be in California in February, and he came out and participated in my research, which was really exciting. It was the first time I had one of my own students there in the desert with me. So yes, I have plenty of work going on here too. I've been working on pollination biology of Calacanthus floridus, the sweet shrub that's pollinated by beetles. So I've done work here on that system and involve students in that research. I also do a fair amount of floristics on different properties around the area. And that's a great way to get students tied into my research. And then my department has an expectation for every major. They have to do an independent research project for 3 semesters with a faculty member. And so sometimes I've managed to get students excited about what I want to study, but mostly they have their own ideas and I help them out with those. So yeah, all of the above, trying to juggle it. It's definitely been a challenge I've had to solve for myself as somebody at a small liberal arts college with not a lot of funding and a big teaching load.
I had a question about the Bighorn sheep.
Yes.
Do you know if there are groups doing research on the population of the sheep there?
That's a really good question. I actually don't.
Okay, because I don't think that they're particularly concerned with the populations of them, but if you had information about the increasing populations, that might bolster an argument that as their population's increasing, or at least in those areas.
Yeah, I know there is data that shows they've increased in this area for sure. But other than that, I don't know that anybody's studying the population specifically.
So I'm curious, we'll attack the sheep a little bit here. You think that they are involved in destroying and increasing the death watch in the desert. Are they, do you think they're utilizing them for food, or are they literally just destroying them and rolling them down the hill?
We don't know for sure. I think probably some of both, but that's one of those questions we really want to figure out how to answer better. We have had some situations where it's been clear that they've just uprooted them and left them to die. There are also situations where I think they've probably eaten them, but I haven't been there to see it happen, so I can't prove that. It wouldn't be unheard of for them to eat a cactus for its moisture, especially. But yeah, that's one of those ongoing questions that we want to figure out how to answer. Anything else?
All right. Well, it sounds like we're nearing an end. I just want to take a moment to thank everyone once again for taking time to participate in this. And I will apologize to Dr. Boyd, because I think about the number of years I've spent traveling to various deserts and kicking over cacti. But I didn't do it as just to be mean. I was kicking them over because one of the group's organisms I work with are slime molds, Myxomycetes.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And I'm going to guess you have encountered a number of Myxomycetes fruiting on the decaying cacti, because you can make field collections all day long in the desert, which when we started working in deserts, we never anticipated to find anything.
Sure, yeah. No, we have seen that.
So I'll be nicer to cacti as I go along, but if it's decaying, they're fair game for hunting slime molds. With that, we'll go ahead and close out. I do want to give a special thanks to Lainey and John, because they do the bulk of the work in coordinating this and making sure that everything runs smoothly. And I think it's been very smooth, and I've certainly enjoyed the presentations we've had thus far, and look forward to those that have to come, and look forward to many more discussions that we can have. I'll put in a plug. Please advertise this to your students, your friends, your colleagues. Anyone can attend. It's a short registration. We'd love to see as many people as possible enjoying each of these talks. Invite you to follow us on Facebook or Instagram, either Lincoln Memorial University or the School of Mathematics and Sciences. And very much looking forward to next week's talk, same time, same place, next Wednesday, January 27th, where we'll hear Dr. Shay Tuberty talk about the role of adventure, exploration, and discovery in the environmental sciences, why we do it, and why it's good for you. For Dr. Tuberty from Appalachian State University. So we look forward to that. I'll tell everyone, thank you. Have a great evening, and hope to see you all with a friend back here next week. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all.
Good job, Amy. So how long?